All right, today I'm going to be going into the major scale. The major scale, we're going to be using the major scale as we study our basics, our beginner's music theory concepts, as we become competent and familiar with the concepts, with all of the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle that music theory is. We're going to start to move into the realm of really for real music, starting with the major scale. So up until now, I've shown about the musical alphabet, like what are pitches, how we assign the letters A to G as notes in the musical alphabet, how those notes have sharps and flats between them, except for B, C, and E, F, and how we can actually move from one note to the next by intervals, which is the distance between notes. And I introduced half steps and whole steps. Half step being one note away from where you are right now. So if I play a note and then I play a note that's one note away, that's a half step. If I play a note that's two notes away or two half steps away, that makes a whole step. So I'm going to be introducing today the major scale, and it's an appropriate name because having a grasp of the major scale is in and of itself a major deal. It's major. It's not like a tiny thing to know about. It's crucial. You understand? So I'm not feeling too well today. I've been going through like the flu and fevers, and so just bear with me, right? Like right now I have no hearing in my left ear. It seems like just went out. But I'm going to try my best to introduce this concept here. But you understand, the major scale, it's made up, but what it's formulated, okay, is a way you could put it. Just like you would go in the kitchen and you would throw some ingredients into a pan and then you saute it, whatever. Then like you do the next step and the next step, and like you put these things together and you go through a certain process, you end up with the meal, right? You have to follow a recipe. Likewise, this is how we can derive or formulate or create the major scale. And the way we do it is using the same whole steps and half steps that I've been talking about, that I introduced in the last video or two. And so what happens is we can create the major scale by starting on any given note and building off from it using whole steps and half steps. First things first, the major scale is a 7-note scale. Now, if you start on an instrument, in music in general, if you start on any note, if you go through all of the notes, like if you start on A, you go A sharp, B, C, right? Because there's no sharp between B and C. Then to go from C to D, C sharp, D to E, D sharp, E to F, there's no sharp, F sharp, G sharp, A, back at A, right? So if you count them all, it's A sharp, B, C sharp, D sharp, E, F sharp, G sharp, A. And like you end up back at A, there's 12 notes in all. So you start on A, there's 12 notes, including that first A, and then you end up back at A is like the 13th note, but it's like it resets because now you're in the octave. You're starting over you're at A again, so you're restarting. So you count that as the first note now, again, of the next octave. And these are all of the possible notes. You could give them also the flat the corresponding flat names. Let me just go through it real quick, because we've been practicing these things, and I have, I've been uploading the shorts and whatnot that you can review these and memorize this with. But if I were to climb up the same way, I could say A, then we have B flat, and then B, and then we have C, and then we have D flat, and then D, then we have E flat, and then E, we have F, we have G flat, and then G, and then we have A flat, and back at A. Same thing, 12 notes, right? And so they have their flat names or their sharp names. It really depends on, it's going to depend on what key you're in. But that doesn't mean anything to us yet. According to what I've talked about up until now, it doesn't mean anything. We're using a building up approach to learning. So we're establishing certain concepts and definitions, and then we're going to add and build it out to where we can fully understand everything, because we have all of the concepts that are necessary to understand the more complicated concepts. And so we have, in essence, all of these notes, but when it comes to the major scale or formulation of scales in general, all scales are formulated or created using formulas like recipes. We're not going to go into a whole bunch of different scales right now. We're just going to talk about the major scale. And the major scale, I said in times past, I view it as kind of like the mothership of music theory. In other words, oftentimes as we move on from now, we're always going to be referring back to the major scale as a reference point. And everything else is understood in terms of the major scale as a derivation, or we're going to be comparing stuff to the major scale, or doing things to the major scale to get our understanding of whatever it is that we're looking at right now that's not the major scale. So it's like the mothership. Remember them alien movies, Independence Day, when they took out the mothership, all of the other things just fell out. If you don't have the main source, the main template, that the source that everything's coming from, like the queen bee, then everything else can't work. So that's what the major scale is going to become for. It's going to become like that for us. So it's very important. It's major. Without it, everything's going to, you can't understand the more advanced concepts. Okay? Oh, excuse me. And I'm in a bad way. Oh man, this is a nasty one. We had 10-degree weather over here in New York. 10-degree weather for multiple days. Snowstorms, and then it goes to 40 degrees, then it's 20, 15, then it goes to 50, 20, 40 something, then now it's in the 20s again. I've been working with flu and fever and just really trying to suffer and get through, but the main thing with anything with developing consistency is that 90% of the battle is you just got to show up. You just got to show up. We're, as humans, I think we tend to overrate how important our performance is on a given day, and we don't look at the big picture enough. So I'll judge myself based off of how good I'm doing at my job today, say. But the main thing is that I showed up, even if I'm kind of lousy today. But I keep showing up every day. Over time, I'm gonna become exceptional. It's the same way with music theory. You show up, you feel rotten like how I do today. Maybe you approach the topic and you're struggling to understand it, but like just show up and look at it. Like expose yourself. Come back tomorrow again. And I have good days and bad days, but 90% of the battle is just to keep showing up every time. And once you do that, you will become exceptional at whatever it is. So anyway, I was hoping this wouldn't happen, but I'm having real trouble here. I'm just going to try to finish off the concept. The major scale, it has a formula. And we define the formula in terms of the whole steps and half steps. Half step is the smallest interval. It's one note away. Also called a semitone. Whole step is two notes away. Okay? 2 notes away. So we build out the major scale, or we can find what are the notes of the major scale. And the major scale is like, I don't know, like if you grew up in my time, they taught us like in school, like do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, and all this kind of stuff. Do, a deer, a female deer, right? Like, I don't know if you're exposed to that. Like, that's literally the notes of the major scale. And I do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, right? Whatever. This is the notes of the major scale. Your ear is familiar with it because you've been exposed to it your whole life. Now, at least if you're American like me. If you're from another part of the world, then other things will sound more familiar to you maybe. But in Western music, this is the music theory we're doing here. The way those notes are found are by using a formula for whole and half steps. And the formula is this way. You start on a note, like you start on the note. Usually this is introduced using the C major scale in the key. So what happens is we could start talking about keys, like what key something is in musically, because once we start to talk about the major scale. So we would say if we're starting on the note C, we would go through all of the letters and end up at C again. We usually start with the C major scale, introducing this. Remember I said that you would use sharps or flats depending on what key you're in? This is like when we start to do these drills, this is when we become exposed to how the dynamic of how that takes place. And so you have different keys depending on what letter you start on. When you use the formula of whole steps and half steps, you're going to end up with sharps or flats depending on what note you're starting on. Okay? And I can't go through all of it. I'm not going to really go through it in this video at all, but we'll be going through this extensively until it's like, duh, yeah, I know that. So the formula is 2 whole steps and a half step, and then 3 whole steps and a half step. So 2 whole steps and a half step, and then 3 whole steps and a half step. So how it works is you start on the first note, C, and then you do a whole step to get to find what is the next note. I'm definitely gonna do another video, like my next video, I'm gonna go through this process slower. I'm gonna go too slow, but for right now, just want to introduce the concept. You have whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. That's the formula. 2 W's and an H, and then 3 W's and an H. That's what tells you how to build out the scale. A scale is a series of notes that are found within one octave. You start on the first note, which is called the root note. It's your root. It's where you're kind of planting your root, where you're starting, where you're anchored, right? So it's your root note. And then you're going to go through an octave until you get back to the root note again, an octave higher. That's how all scales are constructed. And in order to know what notes are in the scale, you have to use the formula for that particular scale. And each scale has its own type of sound and characteristics, the way it sounds. Remember, it's made of intervals. Intervals create, they kind of play off of each other to create feelings and colors, if you will, moods. So depending on what interval formula you use to build out a scale, that's going to determine the flavor of how the music sounds. The major scale formula is whole step, half step, whole step, whole step, whole step, half steps. 2 whole steps and a half, and then 3 whole steps and a half. And the way you build it out is you start on a note, which we're going to call the root note, which is C. In this instance, the C major scale. C because we're starting on C. That's the root note. And the major scale, we're going to use the formula and we build it out. So 2 whole steps and a half step. C, you go up by a whole step. A whole step up from C. You count 2 half steps. C sharp, D. That's a whole step. So from C to D is a whole step. So the second note in the major scale is going to be D. And there are 7 notes in all in the major scale. 7 notes in all. There's 12 notes altogether that exist in an octave, but we're using 7 of them to create the flavor of the major scale, using the formula. So the first step, C to D, is a whole step. The next interval is another whole step. So D, D sharp, E. So the third note in the scale is E. So we have C, D, E. Then we do a half step. E to F. E to F is a half step because there's no note between E and F. See how everything that we've been talking about comes into play now. There's not a note between E and F. So it's just a half step. So starting at C, whole step, D. Whole step, E. Half step, F. Now we have 3 whole steps and a half step. So we're on F, a whole step away is F sharp, G. So the next note is G. C, D, E, I'm sorry. C, D, E, F, G is what we have so far. Then another whole step, G sharp, A. C, D, E, F, G, A. I'll go through this slower in the next video. This video's taking too long, so I'm just gonna go through one example, and the next video tomorrow, when I'm hopefully feeling a little better, I'll go through it and I'm thinking more clearly. I'm gonna go through this slower and really press it out. You gotta learn through familiarity, through repetition, through seeing the same thing over and over again. doesn't matter. Like, if the first time, like, everything I'm saying right now is confusing. It don't matter. Just keep coming back and watching these. Sometimes we need to learn through immersion. You got to keep showing up. Is what it is. A lot of time when you tell yourself like you're not smart enough to learn something, it's not true. It's just that you haven't learned how to learn stuff the right way. Like, you will learn when you keep showing up. You gotta love when people just block a one-lane street. They just block it up. Like, oh, I'm here. You're gonna wait. No, I ain't. I'm gonna reverse out. Anyway. Let's go again. C. 2 whole steps, right? C to D is a whole step. D to E is a whole step. Half step. E to F. Whole step. Half step. Whole, half. C. Whole. D. Whole. E. Half. F. Then 3 whole steps. F to G. G to A to B. Those are all whole steps. And then the last half step leads you back to C. So what happens is you start on the root note, and then you build it out by making these little jumps of whole steps and half steps. And this is a process so when you start on the note C and you do the whole, half, whole, half drill, and you build it out, what ends up happening is you end up with all just letter notes with no sharps. Okay? There's no sharps. And so this is why we start over here, because all of the other keys will have sharps or flats. C is the only key that doesn't. So this is why oftentimes in the C major scale is where the concepts are first introduced. Understand that if you start on another letter like D, you're going to end up with sharps. And I'll go through like all the keys. We're going to do like this video kind of, you know, it's not I'm just introducing really the whole formula. Whole, half, whole, half. But we're going to be going through it over and over and over and over through different keys until we're strong, until we know what we're doing for sure. We're not like guessing, I hope I know this. No, you can learn this. It's not too hard. It's just that you need to go through the process over and over again. You got to get familiar with the process. This is an introduction to the process. I'm going to be making it where it's going to be impossible for you to not know the process at the end. But you got to keep showing up. You understand? If you don't show up, well, hey, you got to pick something to learn from and keep showing up. Or else, you know, this is just how it works. I don't make the rules. Anyhow, other keys like D will sound the same way like C if you're listening to the character of how it sounds, like the colors, the feelings, the way it makes you feel. It sounds like the major scale. No matter what key you're in, no matter what letter you start your root note on, it's going to sound like a major scale. It has that kind of happy kind of feeling to it. But depending on what letter you start with, you're going to end up with sharps or flats. How? Well, we'll go through it in the future videos. You're going to start on a note and you're going to build out whole, half, whole, half. And based off of that, when you go through the process of actually finding what note is a whole step away from here, what note is a half step away from here, and as you do that, you're gonna land. You're gonna know, oh, that's the note. And that's going to tell you, well, man, I landed on a sharp here. So, well, that's the note that's next. All right, so introduction to major scale using whole and half steps. And hopefully tomorrow I'll be feeling a little better. Either way, I'm going to show up tomorrow or whatever next day I make the video. Probably tomorrow. And we'll continue to build the concepts. If you're not really getting it, don't worry about it yet. You gotta keep showing up, because it's 90% of the battle of conquering anything that's worth doing.